this podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Patreon is a monthly subscription that you can cancel anytime, and PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, the handle, the Beirut Banyan. And you can find us on our YouTube channel with the same name, and you can start watching the episodes as they're released. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. I'm Asser Khattab, and this is the Beirut Banyan. This episode's unique. I recorded this back in November. This is just weeks into the protests, and I was pretty much in and out of Martyrs Square. And I was staying in Mar Mikhail, and I would pretty much walk straight into Jemezi, through Martyrs Square into downtown, and then I would walk home. And that kind of back and forth, I mean, you see a lot of your friends and you see a lot of people, familiar faces from different aspects of your life. And during the protests, mostly people going into the protests and coming out, and it was very fluid. It was just in and out. And I would run into people that I interviewed for the podcast, or I would run into someone that I would want to speak to, and it kind of became the perfect route to think about different voices and gauge different minds on different subjects. And Urbanista, just sort of midway through Jemezi, I ended up doing interviews there. The managing partner of Urbanista, Hussam Eid, I actually did an interview with him, and he gave me sort of the green light to let me sit down in Urbanista when needed and record new episodes. And this was just basically time management, where somebody could not come over to Mar Mikhail and record where I was staying, or I was not able to meet them in different neighborhoods. And oftentimes road closings and just sort of things were a bit shaky. So Urbanista became a strategic meeting point. Of course, many people were meeting in Urbanista. And in the episode I did with Hussam Eid, we talk about sort of the cafe culture and how politics fed in. And people were discussing, in a way, every subject possible. In particular, the initial weeks, everything was on the table. So I would bring my portable microphone, sit down in Urbanista, and would basically do interviews there whenever needed. And coming out of an interview, sort of on my way home, I ran into someone that I really wanted to talk to. And it was because of a conversation we had in private, I think maybe days into the protests. And there's a caveat here. That conversation was, I think, alcohol-induced. I think it was several shots into the conversation. It was a very, very friendly conversation, but there was an emotional aspect to it. And I really enjoyed the words that I was hearing. I was hoping that this would not sort of stay in the bar, that this could be taken out into a more sober, more perhaps slightly more sophisticated discussion later. But it stayed in a bar. And when I ran into the guest for the episode today, I asked him if he'd be willing to sit down with me for a few minutes and just talk things out. And he initially said yes, but there was a condition, which was basically that we may not be able to release it right away. and for the right reasons. Asser Khattab was a reporter for the Washington Post. He's a previous reporter for the Financial Times, and for many reasons, he just couldn't lend his name to the subject that we discussed at that time. He kind of opens up his personal story and how that kind of feeds into the protests. And we recorded on that condition that hopefully one day when things are different, we could share the conversation itself. And Asser gave me the green light to release it. He's currently in Paris. He left Beirut, and we get into this as well, sort of his tricky situation in Beirut prior to his departure, and his passion for what he saw on the streets of Beirut, and his own life, and how, in a way, both kind of converged in October 2019. It's a very friendly, sweet conversation about a subject that I thought was very touching and needed to be heard. And I'm just going to say two more things before getting into the conversation. The first is that this is Urbanista, and I learned my lesson. I mean, this was really out of necessity more than anything, but don't do episodes in a cafe because there is a lot of background noise, so I apologize for that. You're going to hear sort of background chatter, you're going to hear cups clinking, and basically there is some background noise, so I apologize for that. The second thing is Asser is a gentleman, and I'm very, very happy that he said yes to this story. And I was worried that it would be buried for a long time and it would take sort of the meaning for the moment would sort of fade over time. So he agreed that we could let it out and let it be shared. Keep in mind, these are reflections of November 2019. So there's no coronavirus. The lira has not sort of collapsed at this point. There's a lot of euphoria, there's a lot of hope, and it's a magical moment in Beirut. So these last 6 months, things have taken a different turn, and things are probably far more painful today. The experience of being in Beirut right now and having to wither the economic collapse at this point compared to 6 months ago, there is a stark difference. So I'll keep that just in the background, that this is a conversation at a different point, but it's an equally important point. And I think a lot of the passion and perhaps some of the optimism, it's still resonating among protesters, among people determined to change Lebanon for the better. So with that said, this is episode 150. And the episode's name, it fits the conversation perfectly. It's something that Asser shares. He says, home more now than ever. So we've known each other for a good 18 months. And I met you at a Financial Times correspondent's home for a dinner. And we kind of became friends as a result of that meeting, although we don't know each other that well. And I know that you're a correspondent, I know that you're a reporter, I know that you cover Lebanon and the region, but we've never talked about your personal emotions, which maybe is a good thing because we had no reason to. But a brief conversation a few nights ago, you said something that made me, in a way, appreciate Lebanon more. And this is coming from somebody who's not Lebanese, somebody who's only lived here 2.5 years. It resonated with me. So I'm going to focus in on that moment. And I don't want to quote you to you, but this is what I remember from that moment. You said that you truly felt comfortable for the first time. And you were describing you walking among protesters, observing the protests. You felt that no one was judging you. And if you could just elaborate on that, and exactly what you meant by that, and we can go back in time and your general relationship to Lebanon. But that particular moment, what did you mean by that?
Places where we work, the areas we cover, where the areas of interest of our companies, the companies that we work for, or the geographic areas where we're based, are also the places where we live in that they're where our social life, they're where we live and have challenges and have friends and have problems and have hurdles, and Lebanon is one of these places. I've been living here, as you mentioned correctly, 2.5 years, and I am Syrian, and Syrians in Lebanon have a special kind of relation, love-hate relation with the country, if I may say, because
and it tilts more in one direction depending on the circumstance.
Exactly. And ever since the influx of hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, these challenges that the relationship between the Syrians and the Lebanese face have been exacerbated a little bit because of the extra pressure that's been added in the country that has already been struggling, the scapegoating of Syrian refugees by Lebanon's politicians, and some of the already existing sensitivities between the two people because of the shared history, which is long and complicated. And I am one of those people who have struggled here. I face certain challenges as a Syrian who cannot go back to his country, as a Syrian who is not able to go to many places due to the circumstances, despite my being a journalist.
Right.
And many times I did not feel welcome. I did not feel welcome legally.
Can I ask you, is that through your profession, or is that just simply on a societal level?
No, this is.
Or is it both?
It's not professional, but mainly because I've been working all this time for international companies. I did not work for a Lebanese company, for example, and I think it's been more about me personally, about my legal challenges, getting anything done, getting a residency permit, getting a work permit, and it's extra hard, if not impossible, for Syrians to access certain documentation that they require, that people from other nationalities are able to require quite easily.
Perhaps not in a very small way. I remember our hesitation with you joining the tour. We were concerned that this would maybe get you in trouble.
True.
And I kind of insisted on it, and I'm glad you came. But so it's that kind of day-to-day problem.
True.
Of just moving around the country without. Okay. Yeah.
And that's not just me. And I have to say here that I am one of the extremely privileged Syrians who live here because, first of all, we said that I work for a foreign company, which means I do not face the stigma from employers who have been hiring Syrians here and not paying them well. And if they're their sponsors, they've been treating them bad. It's kind of a modern slavery because they have authority over their residency and work permits and all of this. And I don't suffer from that. And also socially, thanks to journalism, you run in certain circles and you sort of are protected in a certain way, more than others who have been less privileged. But
in a way, you live maybe the expat lifestyle without being a traditional expat.
Exactly. But the thing is, the ways that Syrians use to cope with living in Lebanon, many of them change their accents, for example, to sound more Lebanese. Many of them try to avoid going to certain areas, like you said when I sort of asked you about every stop that we're going to make on your tour before going on it, and I always felt, whenever I leave my home in Lebanon, I'm worried there's going to be a checkpoint. I'm worried that I'm going to be asked to show documentation or an ID and be asked certain questions about my life here as a Syrian and as a journalist. And I remember on the third day of the revolution, I was down in between Martyrs Square and Riyadh al-Salah. And it was the first day that was...
This was the initial giant protest on Sunday, I believe?
And it was Saturday.
And
Thursday and Friday were a bit violent, the tear gas and the rubber bullets and the arrests. I think 300 people were arrested on Friday. Saturday was more peaceful. Everyone was released and people were there with their children, they were there with their pets, and everyone was there. Everyone has this sort of jovial air around them because they're very proud of what's being done, what they're witnessing. And I remember.
You were there reporting, or
and I was there reporting.
Okay, yeah.
My mom calls me when I'm there, and I pick up, and she says, "Where are you?" And I say, "I'm in Riyadh al-Salah Square, where the demonstration's happening." And she said, "Oh, well, I'm seeing Riyadh al-Salah live."
Sorry to interrupt you. Your mom is in Syria.
She's in Syria,
Okay,
yes.
yeah.
And she asks me, "Aren't you worried that you're a Syrian and you were there? What if something happens to you? Aren't you scared?" And I said, "This is actually the first time
Yeah.
when I do not feel worried being in a public space or doing my work on field in Lebanon, because I can see people chanting. Yes, they were chanting, things against the regime, politicians, capitalism, the authority of banks, but they were also chanting pro-Palestinian and Syrian refugee things. They were sort of expressing the needs and the challenges that people from marginalized communities were facing in Lebanon. And I
On
said,
even a broader scale, you could even argue that women being the front and center kind of perhaps emboldened all types of disenfranchised groups. And there's a range here to be on the streets, to be visible, and this includes
absolutely.
the Syrian refugee or any refugee for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was down there, I was talking to people, and I wasn't one of the people who opted to change their accent. I still have my Syrian accent, and it's quite, detectable for a Lebanese. And no one seemed to have any additional, any follow-up questions regarding my accent, which usually happens whenever I talk to someone here to interview them.
Yeah.
You can sense, even sometimes they express it, and sometimes you can sense their tone changing, on them being like reluctant to speak to you just because you're speaking a Syrian accent.
Can I ask you, this is from a naive position, because I don't know the inner workings of how this works, whether it's translation or just traditional reporting. Are they concerned more that you're reporting for a Syrian outfit, or are they more, is it an individual?
I don't think so. I think to some it sounds ridiculous that a Syrian is calling them and introducing themselves as Washington Post correspondents, because I don't think they.
So that comes up at the beginning. It's not like there's no hesitation that, oh, this is perhaps a media outlet that is.
I don't think so, because they can ask me to prove. I have means to prove who I work for and the media I work for, but we have witnessed. I've always been working alongside people who are from the UK or the US or from Western countries, and
with their fantastic Arabic accents,
or just English. And some people welcome being talked to in English more than being talked to in Arabic.
Right.
And we have seen how more friendly and welcoming some people, especially politicians, have been to my Western colleagues speaking to them than me speaking to them.
Right. Despite being the same outlet.
Exactly.
So it is an individualized thing.
Yes.
Okay.
And I don't choose also to speak to them in Arabic. It doesn't make much sense to me if it's my native language and their native language. So
it doesn't make sense to speak Arabic?
To not speak Arabic. Not to speak Arabic.
Okay,
That's why I don't use English.
Yes, right.
Even though also many Syrians try to use English in order to sort of, not pass as Syrians, but also satisfy some of the people who are more, interested in people who speak foreign languages, because sometimes also they judge you not just on being Syrian, but they differentiate between one Syrian and another. And if you're a Syrian who speaks foreign languages and works for a foreign company, then you're fine, which is also problematic. But it's a privilege that some people take, and it's sort of, I benefit from this, and it's kept me safe so far. So that's
even in terms of language, you notice that the response shifts, whether you're speaking in Arabic, dialect, Syrian,
absolutely,
or you're speaking in English. And I hear a hint of a British accent.
Yes.
So I'm sure even then, does the response get a bit even more exaggerated?
It's better, I get better responses. And the thing is, and this has been my struggle for the past 2.5 years. How am I going to sort out my legal situation? How am I going to... And most of my work is covering Syria, so this can be done from home, on my laptop, via internet, phone calls.
Right.
Whenever I do a Lebanon thing, I'm stressed, I'm scared. I don't want to cause trouble with anyone, because I am vulnerable here. I'm not protected by an embassy or by a certain documentation, and it's worrisome. And the only time, the most time I've done field work in, and the only time I felt safe was this past month, since the outbreak of the uprisings or the revolution.
I find that quite interesting. So covering the revolution has made you feel more at home.
Yes.
And I think because that's a very unique circumstance where somebody in your position who feels uncomfortable covering anything Lebanese, the most Lebanese moment the last 2.5 years, and now you feel you're here.
Exactly.
And I think it's. Do you think that is an intended effort, or is that just simply that is a natural outcome of what we're seeing on the streets? That this is a cohesive way of bringing everyone on board, or is it just simply we don't care because that's not what we're fighting for at the moment? I'm curious, what do you think, where this comes from?
I think it's natural. I think this uprising happened for a reason, and the reasons people are expressing down the street, yes, they're mainly about the getting rid of the rulers that have divided the country and have siphoned off its resources for the past decades, and this is of course according to the people we talk to on the streets. But it's also about other smaller things, not small, well, they're all valid challenges, but there are things that interest everyone in Lebanon, and challenges that everyone here is facing, and there are certain things that certain groups of people face more than others. And when we spoke about people supporting Syrians and Palestinians, I know that these people have always existed. We know that the Lebanese are not inherently racist or bad or xenophobic, but unfortunately for the past decades it seems that the state-led xenophobia or racism, so against Syrians, against Palestinians, against refugees in general, and this is what people have also been expressing.
Allowed that kind of expression.
Yes, and the focus, and we know that across the world, really, when thousands of people say the good thing, but when someone says the bad thing, this gets amplified and it gets sort of, it gets more focus. If someone says something incredibly racist, it's going to have more resonance than thousands of people saying something welcoming to refugees.
I'm curious, what you're identifying here, which is the most visible antagonism towards the Syrian refugee community, that those individuals have become at times a laughingstock here. They've been insulted on the streets. Chants have emerged from those insults. Some of them are quite rhythmic. Do you think that plays into the story, that because those voices have been really they've taken a beating, do you think that has allowed perhaps a more vocal tolerance of refugees?
Yes, absolutely. And I remember I was talking to someone on the 5th or 6th day of the uprisings, also in Beirut, and I was talking to him about all the challenges that he's been facing, and he's been sharing what he wants, what he's fighting against. And he stops at some point and says, we are also here for Syrians and for Palestinians, and he's Lebanese, of course.
He tells you this?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And
it's just he comes out of...
Yes, clearly...
He knows that you're Syrian.
Yes,
so
he's realized I'm Syrian from my accent, and he looks at me and points at me and we say, we're here for Syrians, we're here for refugees, because refugees are welcome, and those who are racist against refugees are the ones that aren't welcome here. They feel like this divide that exists, and it does exist, between the Syrians and the Lebanese, in spite of the mutual history and culture. They feel like it's been imposed on those people by politicians, by rulers of both countries, and they want to change that. It's one of the things that they want to change, and it's not separate to them. To many of them, it's not separate from the bigger goals. They want to topple the establishment for financial reasons, for anti-corruption reasons, but the xenophobia and racism are also included in that package that they want to get rid of, and this is part of the reason why I felt safe there, and that's why I told my mom this is the safest that I've ever felt, and it was true.
That's That's quite fascinating. And I'm curious about your own relationship now as somebody who's working from Lebanon and considers Lebanon home. Before we start,
Now more than before.
now more than before. Watch us now get rid of you. I love you guys. Off. Go home. I hope not. No,
I hope not
no. And I think I'd be one of the first people there to get you out if I can. I'll do what I can to get you out. Your relationship to Lebanon prior to all this, and I know this is a very subjective view, it's just your own instincts, and you mentioned before we started recording that you used to visit Lebanon as a child from Syria.
True.
And I think many people simply just visit. I mean, I remember going to Syria. I remember flying into Syria to get to Lebanon during the Civil War. I mean, such a sizable number of people that have experienced both countries prior to this whole decade of violence in Syria. And of course the refugees that live here today. Do you recall having these emotions and these views prior to reporting on Lebanon? Or are these coming out of your profession? Meaning that you're seeing things in a different way because your job involves sort of analyzing and trying to get to the politics of the situation plays a larger role because of your profession, or did you always feel like this, that you were in a sense judged or unwelcome or treated differently even as a younger person visiting Lebanon? I'm wondering, is that something that resonates because you're so invested in covering the region that you see it in ways maybe other people don't? And this is a very subjective opinion. I'm just trying to see where, because it's quite a bold statement to feel at home.
True.
Right?
True.
Shows that there's been a burden at stake. Was that burden there before you started living here and covering?
It wasn't so much of a burden before moving here. It actually became a real burden and challenge after having moved here. And it's a long story, but I did not choose to come and live here.
Right.
I had to leave my country at some point, and I flew to Sudan, where I spent a few months, and then I also needed to go somewhere else, and I only have a Syrian passport.
Yeah.
And if for a country that's been at civil war and has exported hundreds of thousands or even millions of refugees over the past few years, the Syrian passport doesn't take you to many places now. So I had to come here, and I didn't have any other options really.
Okay.
And I wanted to find work. I didn't come here, with a job offer waiting
Right.
for me. So
So
I came here and started looking.
So you were a refugee, but not from Syria, sort of via Sudan.
Yes,
You-
via
yeah.
Sudan. Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And I never registered as a refugee because Lebanon banned UNHCR from registering new refugees in 2015,
Okay.
and I only arrived here 2017.
Right.
It wasn't a burden before. We always felt. I used to come here since before the year 2015, which was the year when Lebanese General Security imposed new regulations on Syrians' entry and residency in Lebanon.
Right.
And I remember in 2016, 2017, prior to my leaving Syria, I really needed Lebanon because I was working in Damascus or out of Damascus as a journalist for various international media organization. I at some point had a full-time job as a correspondent for the Spanish news agency, and I needed to come to Lebanon almost every month to get my salary and to make phone calls to opposition areas,
Right.
because that's not something you can do from Damascus,
Right.
especially when you live a few blocks away from the Ministry of Information.
So you were covering the Syrian war from Lebanon at times, even though you were still based in Syria. For days.
Yeah,
Okay,
a few days every month or two.
Okay.
And but then it was every time I would come here, despite the frequency of my visits, it was difficult. It was hard. I would have to worry about it. I would have to start asking, if I'm going to be let in or if I'm not going to be let in. And I
Right.
always managed to sort of go in. I was never sort of stopped at the border or sent back, which happens to Syrians every day. It did not feel as much of a challenge at the time because they used to give me a short-term visa which is still kind of attainable for Syrians until this very day. 3-4 days visa is not a big problem.
Right.
When I came here and I had to struggle with long-term visas, is when it became a bigger challenge to me, especially as someone who cannot afford to be deported to their country.
Right.
And to be honest, for the most part of the past 2.5 years, we did not do a lot of work in Lebanon because prior to the eruption of the uprisings on October 17, it was mostly about Syria, and it was hard to get the international media to publish about Lebanon unless something major was happening. So in the past 2.5 years, I started working for the FT right after the first time that Prime Minister Hariri announced his resignation from Saudi Arabia, and then he revoked it. So there was some reporting on Lebanon happening at the time. I didn't get to do that. I started only afterwards, and we got to do some Lebanon.
It was kind of a hard sell to package Lebanon as a story. Okay.
Especially for newspapers who always want the regional angle and the global or the regional effects of things that are happening, which is something you can find in Syria coverage every day.
Yes.
Not so much in Lebanon prior to October 17.
Right.
And now this changed. Now we have, and to me this is another thing that I really appreciate is getting to do field work once again, because since coming to Lebanon in June 2017, I haven't done much field work. First, because my situation, and also because not much was happening that my employers were interested in.
Yeah.
And now it's different. Now I'm back on the street, which is what I registered for when I wanted to become a journalist, is being on the streets, talking to people and hearing from them.
Those individual issues still remain, though.
Yes, they still remain.
Okay. So in a sense, it's just for the moment, there's an emotional, there's an emotion that is shared between yourself and the average person on the street. I hope that translates into something else, because it's nice to see that turn into something more productive.
Quite frankly, I think I can say that before October 17, I never really loved Lebanon. I didn't hate it, but I didn't go out of my way to love the country. For the most part, I did not feel welcome, as we were saying.
Yeah.
And it's hard to feel not welcome in a place that where you sort of found yourself in, not because of your choosing, and a place that where you're ready to do whatever you can to fix your situation and feel welcome, and you're not hostile towards, and you're working in, you're trying to spare no moment. But I never felt welcome, and I always felt discriminated against because of who I am, because of the passport that I carry, and because of my identity. Yeah. And it is unfair, and I think as a result, I was never too attached to Lebanon. I don't know if I would have called it home a few months ago. Maybe I would have, maybe I wouldn't have, but when the uprising started, and regardless of the point of the uprisings and where I stand, because whenever I'm there covering, and I'm there as a journalist. But
I was going to say, maybe that's in a way the benefit of your situation, that you don't feel at home, and that maybe that disallows you from being persuaded in any way.
True. And this revolution is happening, and it's historic for most of the Lebanese people I'm talking to.
Yeah.
And it's not mine, of course, not as a Syrian, not as a journalist, but it's a fact that when you go to a certain place and you feel welcome, you talk to someone, you feel welcome, and you don't worry, because no one's going to ask you to present your ID or your passport before they talk to you. You're a journalist to them you're a journalist that wants to talk to them and convey their voice and their concerns before being a Syrian. And to many others before October 17, I was a Syrian. That is maybe sometimes a good thing for some people who belong to certain groups, and a bad thing for many people who belong to other groups.
Yeah. Just to wrap it up, I wanted to sort of take it a step further. And in our brief conversations that we've had, I've found myself at times oddly explaining my thoughts to you, and I think you have a way of asking certain questions that it's a reporter's technique, I think, that you just sort of end up getting 10-minute answers. It's not, how's your day going? It's usually, so what is, and I end up trying and I don't want to, but I do it anyway. And in a recent conversation, I just mentioned Samir Asir's name. And I think I took it upon myself to send you something about him, a documentary about him. To me, I can speak on behalf of many people in my generation. I think he enabled a lot of protesters to see through certain prejudices, a left-wing Christian and a French national who wrote in French and Arabic about Hamra's affairs. So a very mixed man. And I know that your career is very different than his, and I know that it's also a generational shift. But I think these kinds of voices, they help tear down barriers. And I'm pretty sure that you were doing that already before the revolution. I think it's not that hard to knock that wall down. And I think maybe the revolution made it just a little easier, but it's always there. And I think I feel bad for anyone that didn't enjoy your friendship for prejudice. And if they're changing their minds now, at least it's not too late. But it resonated with me that you felt the other end, which is Lebanese were opening their arms more to someone like you. So, with that, I really thank you for letting me ask you questions in return. It's the first time. And I look forward to reading more of your articles, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.